Since their introduction in the 1970s, stone-dialed watches have ebbed and flowed in popularity, and now I think that we're seeing a bit of a renaissance in the category. Today's episode is sponsored by Z Biotics. More on them later. And yeah, today's episode is exciting for me because I love stone dials. I love weird watches. I love alternative materials, which is where this conversation will ultimately be going today. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of stone dial watches, and the reason why it's coming up, oddly enough, is because a microbrand named Baltic, if you can even call them a microbrand anymore, because their success in the last few years has just been so fantastic that I think they may have even outgrown the title. They've introduced a collection of 3 different stone dial watches, each for a specific market, being sold through their brick and mortar locations in New York, Paris, and London. And they chose to design these watches using, I think really beautiful, distinctive stone dials. And I think that if we rewind 5 years, this would have been really bizarre. We never would have expected something like this to happen because stone dials really, are not the, they're not the belle of the ball, right? People aren't really talking about them very often. And it's, they're a weird piece of watch history, specifically Rolex history. And we'll talk about Rolex's pioneering of these dial materials in a little while. But we wouldn't have seen this, right? If 5 years ago, 8 years ago, we wouldn't have even seen color like this. But then there were a couple of things that happened in the watch industry that introduced color in a really bold manner and sort of, let everyone dip their toe into the water and find out that everything's just fine. We can wear watches that are, green and watches that are turquoise and things like this. I would say specifically that'll change with the Oyster Perpetual releases, right? Rolex, in releasing these wild colors in their most affordable model, I think it really, opened up a new chapter in kind of modern watch culture. I'm old enough to remember the days when a Hulk, what is now looked at as a, maybe not so daring watch, was a daring watch. People wanted a Hulk, kind of like, that was like a dirty little secret. It was kind of like something they would want, but they couldn't have it. I couldn't wear that. That's green. That's too much color. Right now, it's the most. I love it, but it's not a very daring watch at all. Things get far wilder on a daily basis. So it's interesting if we take a look back over the last 10 years, and then, largely over history since the 1970s when they were introduced, but to see this ebb and flow, right? What is the average watch consumer comfortable wearing? It's an interesting, it's an interesting question, and it's a historical question, but now, just a couple of years after that door has been reopened and people are wearing color again, now we're seeing things get weirder and weirder. And I think that's a really good thing, right? Not so long after people wouldn't wear a red watch, now they're wearing a red stone dial watch. And that's kind of wild, right? And that's a really good sign. I don't want to make this whole episode about Baltic. They were kind of the impetus or, the conversation. But side note, they did a really good job with these watches. I think it's amazing how they've grown. I think it's amazing. I think the company's success story is amazing. But I think these watches are great. Obviously modeled after Patek Philippe's vintage Calatrava, specifically the reference 96. The style is not daring at all, right? The watches themselves are very conservative. And I think that a conservative canvas is the best canvas for a bizarre alternative material, right? It kind of, again, I think it allows everyone to sort of dip their toe in the water and find out everything's just fine, right? You don't want a really bold case and a really bold dial and really bold hands because everything's sort of competing and it seems like there's no balance. But a really conservative canvas makes for, I think it gives the perfect opportunity. It allows the dial to really speak and be the show. I'll talk for one more second about Baltic here before we move on into other subjects of alternative materials, specifically stone dials. And it's this. Not all, as we would know, it's somewhat common sense, but sometimes it's, we forget it. There's a large spectrum of color, even within a particular stone. Not all lapis is the same, not all coral is the same, not all malachite is the same. Of course, that's an obvious statement, right? These are natural stone dials, so by definition, no two are the same. But even further than that, the palette is totally different. Baltic here chose to go with lapis that is, I would say, sort of cloudy and kind of conservative, as opposed to, heavily gold-flecked lapis that, is more gaudy, right? They chose, I think they did a really great job choosing their stone dials, essentially what I'm trying to say here. They went with, again, muted, while bold, of course, within the world of the stone dial, still pretty conservative choices. This is not an easy thing to do. Dial selection is very difficult. I know people that have purchased Rolex mother of pearl dials, which we'll get to in a second, that were waiting for the right mother of pearl because they're all very different. They're all very different. They catch the light different, right? Just because you want a mother of pearl day-date doesn't mean you want any mother of pearl day-date. Just because you want a lapis lazuli dial, I mean, that could mean 1,000 different things. And frankly, no matter how much money you're spending, but particularly when you're spending luxury money, you should be specific, and you should be, sort of picky, right? We don't need any of these things. They're purely for, vanity, I suppose. So you might as well get the one that you actually, really want. So good job to Baltic, all well and good. Today's episode is sponsored by ZBiotics, the world's first genetically engineered probiotic, and it's a staple in my house because ZBiotics is the perfect pre-alcohol beverage. It's a probiotic drink that breaks down the byproduct of alcohol, which is responsible for those rough mornings after drinking. Not to say that anyone should ever be pushing themselves to those rough mornings after drinking, but as we all know, many times they're somewhat inevitable. And frankly, so far as I've seen it, even though I'm only 29, the older I get, the more likely I am to have those rough mornings after drinking. That's why I've made ZBiotics such an important part of my routine. If I know I'm going to go out on a Friday night, be it with a friend or a loved one or a client, I know that if I have ZBiotics before I go out, the likelihood that my Saturday morning is going to be beautiful is far higher. That I'm not going to be waking up with that, that headache or that somewhat sickness. I don't experience it at the frequency anymore, right? This has really improved my lifestyle. Of course, it's also incumbent upon us to manage our drinking. There's no question there. But naturally, we'd like to sometimes have our cake and eat it too. So how does it work? For best results, make this pre-alcoholic drink your first drink of the night. Of course, number 2 is pace yourself, hydrate, and get a good night's sleep. And finally, and it's so easy, step 3 is wake up the next day and just have a better, more energized morning. ZBiotics was invented by PhD scientists to tackle this exact problem, to break down that toxic byproduct in the gut. It's that byproduct, a toxin, not dehydration, that's responsible for your next day being rough, and ZBiotic attacks exactly that. So go to zbiotics.com/Theo and Harris and get 15% off of your first order. Again, use the code Theo and Harris and get 15% off of your first order and start having better morning afters. It's that simple. Moving on, though, into a bit of the history and where we see, kind of parallel technology or maybe not technology, but, I don't know what the word is, I guess pushing the boundary in design in other alternative materials. Let's go back to the 1970s. This is when Rolex really started. Rolex became the pioneer of these sorts of dials. I'm not saying that Rolex was the first, manufacturer to play around with stone dials, but they certainly were the pioneer. I think that's a simple way to put it. Rolex was offering a catalog of dials. While the dealers were not stocking them, they had a catalog, and they would allow special customers to, at an additional cost, order their watch with a stone dial. It's pretty cool. This is, again, maybe not unprecedented, but certainly extremely uncommon. And, and Rolex bet on it. They bet big on it. And it worked, right? Because Rolex watches, while obviously very much mass market and very standard issue to, the rich or the aspiring rich, they were still fun. They were still fun and weird and again, while super mass market and mass produced, right? They still... they got freaky with it, right? Which you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? Usually those two things don't go hand in hand, right? Freaky watches are usually for the small independents. That's generally where that happens, right? But here, Rolex is sort of an anomaly in that, right? Rolex, such a big part of their identity and catalog and history, is kind of predicated upon this. Yeah, let's make really weird watches and only a few of them, and maybe someone will unearth them one day, which is exactly what Philips watches did with their inaugural auction back in 2015, I believe. The day-date auction, where they went and found all of these bizarre day-dates, and everyone scratched their head and said, "Wow, I didn't have any idea really that Rolex was so inventive, that Rolex was so divergent, right? It's a mass market manufacturer, and yet they have played around so much with texture and with color and with material." They really set the precedent for that. I think that's really impressive. But again, it wasn't just with stone dials. Now you fast forward, and I mean, a couple of examples, right? Long & Zone recently, in the last couple of years, introduced a Saxonia Thin with what looks like an aventurine dial, but isn't, right? I mean, it's clearly mimicking a natural stone dial. So that's what they're going for. But this is a manufactured dial, right? And it's made its way into their main collection, and to many people, myself included, these watches are regarded as some of the coolest Langas that are manufactured. You have mother of pearl at Patek, and I'm just talking about the highest of manufacturers now, right? You can go into, right? I mean, it sounds crazy, but even case materials, you can go into people who have manufactured carbon fiber cases, people that have manufactured sapphire cases. You can look at Hublot, right, with their fusion. You could look at micro brands. You could look at Aventi, right? And not only are these brands making sapphire, but they're making their own sapphires, right? They're further complicating or reimagining what a case can be, what a material can be. That goes into movements, of course, as well. Movement, pushing the boundaries of what is possible in respect to mechanics is, predates what is possible and pushing it in dials and cases, right? That is a somewhat, new idea, right? Dials go back to the 60s, case material and really pushing those boundaries is fairly new, right? I mean, there's only a small handful of manufacturers that are really pushing those boundaries. But look at on the movement end. And this wasn't even for vanity. I mean, this was for technology. This was engineers saying, how can we make these watches do more? How can we make them more complicated, more interesting, more accurate, more able, right? So maybe even equally able, but lasting longer, right? Introducing different materials like ceramic or all these different materials, into movements. Long story short, if that's even possible at this point, I do love to see this kind of, I guess, ebb and flow, and particularly, I like to see when we're in an era of openness, which is where we are in the watch industry now. It seems to me that unlike maybe 10 years ago when I got into the watch industry as a hobbyist and then professionally, it seems to me that, brands are being very much rewarded for ingenuity. They're being very much rewarded for, divergent design, playing around with materials, color. We're not in an era of conformity, right? And I don't think that, we're not just trying to be, wild for the sake of being wild. I think that these things are interesting and tasteful. Are they for every day? Probably not for most folks, right? Stone dials, I would say, probably are. And so someone recently spoke to me on the phone about looking at a wood dial dated, the mahogany dials. And I said, they're great dials. You're going to wear it every day, or you're going to wear it, at the frequency that which you can justify buying it. I think that's a different question. But Baltic did a great job here. I mean, the prices are under $1,500, and they're incredibly beautiful and interesting watches. I think they did a great job. I don't know how available they'll be, but it represents an era of openness in the industry. I love to see brands again, from small brands like Baltic or Aventi or brands higher up in price going into Patek or going into Lange or going into like that. I like to see their bold, somewhat weird watches get rewarded, right? Because it means that we are, as a watch culture, moving in the right direction. I love the Daytona. I don't love what it represents, right? The Daytona represents, kind of conformity, kind of everyone jumping over each other to spend 2x on a watch that is fantastic, but a little bit, a little bit generic, relatively speaking. And I love it. I will wear a Daytona in a second. But that didn't represent the best of us. I don't think it represented, everything that the watch industry can, right? Which is, a little bit of independent thinking. And I think that stuff like this really does. So great job, Baltic. And that's it. If you're interested in more videos from Tim Harris, press subscribe and follow us here on YouTube. And if you want more content from us, including a lot of behind the scenes stuff, head on over to The Zero. Link is down below and see what we've got over there. It's really great. See you soon.